You're a palm tree with the guy's sister, the guy beats up the guy. You can't do that with my sister. And so on and so forth. In other words, it was made up. It was what we would call the Blue Lagoon anthropology, based on, you know, the Blue Lagoon movie with Brooke Shields. It's basically, it's like the plot of Lord of the Flies. The plane is flying. It crashes on this tropical island in the Pacific, and suddenly, hey, all bets are off. Because all of that stuff you believe was the moral law, that's all bourgeois morality. There's no bourgeoisie here. So morality doesn't have any force anymore, and we can all live like, you know, free and wonderful people. The French had this fantasy. Rousseau was probably the main proponent of it with his idea of the noble savage. And now it caught on in America as a way of undermining the whole idea that there was a Christian morality that should be normative for this country.
So it was a mythology, but it was a very effective mythology. Margaret Mead essentially created a mythical anthropology that was accepted as gospel. Again, her writings aren't very important except for the fact that they were promoted and became intellectual gospel, to the point that even after she was debunked and was shown to be a myth, shown to be false, shown to be either lies or misinformation, that she is still ionized. And people were horrified that her reputation would be called into question. So it's a very powerful thing that anybody who disagrees with all this is up against. It's got a huge inertia at this point. It's very hard to change. These things take on a life of their own. It's a matter of promotion. It's not a matter of truth or reality. It's a matter of leading a movement that has an influence. And so the influence comes not so much from the original person, but from the infrastructure, the publishing houses, the media, the professors in universities who assign Margaret Mead as part of their courses. You know, this is where it achieves a life of its own, and it is seen as true, it is seen as science, it is seen as inviolably correct. And I think the concept of race is very respectable. But still, the concept of race is profoundly controversial. So this is the legacy of that, and we still see that in the present, because people like Philippe Rushton at the University of Western Ontario in Canada, Richard Lynn, their analyses of racial differences in intelligence in different peoples of the world is the exact sort of thing that is anathema to the Boasian school, and that continues with us today, because the writings of people like Rushton and Lynn are marginalized. They're not talked about. If they're ever mentioned in the newspapers, they tend to be qualified and bring in all these other people who say that's nonsense. You can't even give the concept of intelligence doesn't make any sense. There is no such thing as race, etc. You know, so it remains problematic to this day. The transformation of the universities in the United States in the direction of political correctness, a lot of that has to be laid at the foot of Franz Boas. Sigmund Freud is the most famous psychologist of the 20th century. Like Franz Boas, he started his school of psychology. Like Franz Boas, he viewed anti-Semitism as an enormous problem. He himself was subjected to anti-Semitism when he was young, as was Franz Boas. And this stayed with him. This was an important part of their psyche, and you can see this in their writings, that they viewed the eradication of anti-Semitism as a very important criterion for a good theory, basically. So at a deep level, psychoanalysis was about developing a theory that could be used to oppose anti-Semitism. Freud consciously viewed himself as someone who was combating Western culture. He viewed himself as a sort of Semitic general fighting Rome. There's some very striking passages in his letters. He identified with Hannibal, who was a Semitic general fighting against Rome. In Jewish thought, Rome is often viewed as the quintessential West. And when they think of Rome, they think of Rome destroying the Second Temple, that Rome fundamentally as this sort of evil Western power. And Freud viewed himself as psychoanalysis was a mechanism of cultural warfare, as it were. Psychoanalysis was sort of flagrantly unscientific. I mean, they didn't even make the pretense of doing a good study of anything. At the time, you know, in the early 20th century, the dominant school in psychology in America and England was behaviorism. You know, and behaviorism, even though I'm not a behaviorist at all, what you have to say about the behaviorists is that they had a strong sense that psychology had to be based on experimentation. You had to have control groups. You had to have well-validated observations and instruments. This was completely foreign to psychoanalysis. So, psychoanalysis, even though it made a huge impact on the culture, even though it dominated departments of psychiatry, it did not dominate departments of psychology to anywhere near that extent. And that's because departments of psychology in America and England had this strong empirical sense. And so they criticized psychoanalysis. They went, where's your data? I mean, show me some studies. Even some of Freud's followers, very early on, became disillusioned with it. They didn't see the data. They started to realize that psychoanalysis is basically a set of propositions that are being promulgated by leaders. And if you were a follower, you would simply accept these. If you did not accept them, you were simply written out of the movement. So it was not conducted as a normal science. And that produced skepticism among behaviorists and other American psychologists, so that it never got that extent of domination in psychology. Where it really was important and really dominated was in the area of psychiatry. Psychiatry became dominated by the Freudians, but that has disappeared because of the rise of biological psychiatry. I mean, nowadays, when psychiatrists think of depression, they're much more likely to think about what drugs you can use, what parts of the brain are involved in depression. Of course, we didn't have that back in the early 20th century, and so psychoanalysts could say anything they wanted about depression or neurosis. They could make up stories about repressing sex or whatever story they wanted. And that was pretty much accepted. And then you'd bring patients who had neuroses in, you'd talk to them, and hopefully they got better. Maybe they didn't. Mostly they didn't.
A kind of quack from Berlin invited Freud to come to Berlin and visit with him. And Freud wrote back and said, I'd like to come, but I'm afraid my patients will get well in my absence. This gives you some indication of the predatory attitude that Freud had toward his patients. He had a cartoon that he used to keep in his office, a lion, and under the lion it says, Schon 12 Uhr Mittag und keiner Neger. It's already noon and no Negroes. In other words, I'm hungry, I need a Negro to come in here, I need to eat the Negro. Well, who's the Negro? Well, that's the patient. And so the best example would be Horace Frink, this doctor from America. He wants to be a psychoanalyst, so he shows up with Freud, and during the course of his psychoanalysis with Freud, he says, I have this sexual attraction toward my patients. Isn't this bad? I mean, isn't it bad if you screw one of your patients? Isn't that unethical? Not to say even beyond the fact that you're married to someone else. Well, what does Freud say? Well, no, he didn't think it was a bad idea. As a matter of fact, he urged Frink to dump his wife and marry this woman because she had a lot of money, and then give a significant contribution to the Psychoanalytic Society. I mean, this is outrageous. This is an outrageous conflict of interest, an outrageous abuse of the whole idea of medicine, and certainly an abuse of what psychiatry is. And Freud himself was involved in it. This isn't an abuse. This is the heart of the matter, because psychoanalysis is a form of sexual liberation as political control.
I think the genius of Freud was to develop a sort of metaphor or sort of paradigm that people resonated to automatically. Because, obviously the repression of sexuality sort of was an important part of Western culture. I was just struck watching the movie Kinsey, which is about Kinsey, the sexual reformer. He was not really a Freudian, but you could see that repression of sexuality that was so typical a part of the culture in which he grew up in, where you were concerned about if masturbation was a sin. I remember growing up in the 1950s in a religious environment, feeling guilty about, any kind of impure thoughts about women's sexuality, much less doing things. So that was part of our culture. And I think people, obviously, some people did not fit well with them. They saw that as inhibiting their natural desires and so on. So it became a sort of rallying point, I think, for the intellectual left. People like Kinsey were certainly greeted by psychoanalysts, and you could see him having problems with his religious environment. His father was a preacher. His father viewed, sex as evil, and essentially, and that was part of the zeitgeist at the time. So when Freud, talked about sex as the fundamental basis of all things neurotic, it had a certain surface plausibility. It wasn't ridiculous, I suppose. It wasn't based on science, but it was based, I think, on a sort of attractive paradigm.
Sigmund Freud became the learned Jew when it came to the doctor. In other words, you got a problem, go to the doctor. The doctor has science. The scientist will cure you. Well, that was sort of the myth that got promoted about Sigmund Freud after the fact, around the same time that the Margaret Mead fraud is coming to light. It turns out that that's not exactly what Sigmund Freud was doing.
One of the things I've noticed with Jewish intellectual movements is they tend to be centered around a sort of charismatic leader. Certainly Boas was that way. Freud was that way to the max. I mean, he was the quintessential guru with devoted disciples who were centered around him. They developed the associations of psychoanalysis were very highly organized, top-down societies. People who dissented from these doctrines were excluded. So it was not really scientific in the normal sense. We think of a science as open to new ideas, that you could have a study that would disprove something like the Oedipal complex or something like that. That would be perfectly normal in a real science. In psychoanalysis, anybody who disagreed with the Oedipal complex was simply expelled. And usually they would be expelled with saying they had psychopathology. So it was not conducted as a normal science. There were a sort of central organization. People who dissented were expelled. People who were on board were admitted, and but there was a sort of pecking order. If you were close to Sigmund Freud, if you had personal